Start recording. Okay, very good. Thank you all for coming this evening. This again is the third class. You can ignore what it says on the screen where it says lesson number 5. This is the third class in our series on participating in Tefillah B'Tzibur, understanding prayer, understanding the necessity and the importance of our community obligations, at least as far as Tefillah goes. And today we're going to be discussing the origin of the siddur, not origin of the siddur, excuse me, the origin of the synagogue, the origin of the shul. Now, if you were to think back throughout much of Jewish history, at least since the destruction of the Second Temple, I think that there has not been a single Jewish institution that has done more to save the Jewish people than the shul, than the Beis Knesset. No matter where we go, no matter what Jews do, we're always encumbered by this obligation to daven with a minyan. There we go. We're always obligated to pray as a community. So that means that no matter where you go, no matter where you move, you always have to try and find a Jewish community, or you have to be part of a group of pioneers who come together, move to a specific location. So the shul is really, really important. We have an obligation to daven with a minyan, but the shul anchors us to the community because we have this obligation to pray 3 times a day with other Jews. We're always keyed in, we're always integrated, we always form a coherent and cohesive community. The shul serves as a social safety net. And what do I mean? Well, if you think about it like this, if you have a small Jewish community in a town and you have one minyan and people are attending minyan 3 times a day, and somebody falls sick, everybody knows. Everybody who goes to the shul is aware that so-and-so is unwell. That means that they can group together. They can ensure that, that the family has something to eat. They can drive the kids to shul. We're aware of each other. We're interacting with each other. And that's to a large extent serviced by attending shul, by attending the Beis Knesset pretty regularly. And that's really been the pattern, that's been the trend throughout much of our history. If somebody loses a job, for example, everyone in the community knows they can support one another. They can pat him on the shoulder if he's feeling down, and maybe they have some connections with somebody they're working with, and a job can perhaps be found. We come together for community celebrations, like of a person's bar mitzvah, a bris milah. Shul forms a really valuable role in fostering companionship between various members of the community. And again, this has been the historical trend, the historical pattern throughout much of our history. And you can also think back to a time when we did not have rapid communication, when people did not travel all that much. If you had a young man, 18 years old, 19 years old, who's ready to get married, how do we find a spouse for him? If people don't travel and, people tend to stay rather sedentary, the shul facilitates, people banding together and thinking about perhaps there's a cousin, perhaps there's a young girl that we know in the community the next town over. The shul really serves to create that cohesive community, not only in the location in which the shul exists, but also perhaps to an extent key into other communities elsewhere. So as far as Jewish survival goes, I believe that the shul has been the most important institution throughout the past 2,000 years. So that being said, if I were to ask you the question, if that is the case, that the shul has been the most important Jewish institution since in the past 2,000 years, well then, what is the biblical verse? Is there a biblical verse that teaches us that one is obligated to build a shul, form a minyan, come together as a community? If you were to make that assumption, regrettably, you would actually be incorrect. There is not a single biblical verse that says make a shul. Sometimes people refer to the verse that says, "V'nikdashni b'soch b'nei Yisrael," I shall be sanctified in the midst of the Jewish people, which is a verse that we read in Parshas Teruma, which seems to be talking about the Mishkan. Sometimes that gets applied to the shul, where we're creating a sanctuary for God in our midst for us to meet with Him. Well, that verse, while it's nice that we can apply it to the shul, it's actually not talking about a Beis Knesset. It's actually talking about the Mishkan, the sanctuary that was used in the desert, and by extension, possibly the Beis Hamikdash, but that verse is really not talking about a shul. So then the following assumption would then be made, perhaps. If the shul is not a biblical imperative, and tefillah, prayer, seems to be very much grounded in this idea that since we no longer have the Beit HaMikdash, we no longer have the temple, we no longer have the Beis HaMikdash, perhaps the synagogue then is an institution that was created, that came into existence after the destruction of the temple, that would also be an erroneous conclusion. There have been archaeological digs. We find in the archaeological record synagogues, shuls, bate knesios, synagogues that precede the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Shuls existed as an institution before the temple was destroyed. And I'm actually going to jump the gun a bit. I'm actually going to scroll down here to the next page. Come on, you can do it. You're a smart computer. Figure it out. Oh, okay, there we go. Take a look over here. This is on the third page of the handout that you all have for those who are present, and for those of you at home, you see this on the very bottom. This is actually a plaque. You know how when you walk into the shul and you see that this mezuzah was donated by Yankel Fishhacker, or the study was donated by Yosef Shlomazelman, who donated in honor of so and so's passing. Well, we actually know that actually predates our shul by 2,000 years. What you see on the bottom of the page is actually an inscription of a plaque found on a shul that was unearthed in Jerusalem from the first century, in the decades that preceded the destruction of the temple. And this is what it says. You can read it on the bottom of your page. It says, Theodosius, son of Vitinus, priest and archisynagogos, the ruler of the synagogue, son of an archisynagogos, I guess the son of the president, grandson of an archisynagogos, built this synagogue for the reading of the law, which is Kriyas Torah, the reading of the Torah, and for the teaching of the commandments, and the guest chamber, and the rooms, and the water installations, for lodging for those in need, those needing them from abroad, which his fathers, the elders, and Simonides founded. So you see that there is a synagogue that has a plaque that says that this building was built by so-and-so in honor of such and such, and this structure predates the destruction of the temple. And on that same page, if you were to scroll up, take a look over here, you actually have a Mishnah. A Mishnah here that's describing, the Mishnah here is describing the practices in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, on the night of Yom Kippur. And what does it say here? Well, we know that the Kohen is not supposed to sleep that night. He's supposed to stay up all night studying Torah. And so what they did in order to ensure that the Kohen would remain awake was that they would have him read from various texts. And this is what it says. Bolo Kohen Gadol likros. We bring the Kohen Gadol to read from the Torah on the night of Yom Kippur to keep him awake. If he wants to read while wearing his Kohanic garb, he's allowed to. V'im lo, but if he does not want to wear his Kohanic garb, we say he's allowed to wear his own clothing. Kore bi'tztalis lavan mishalo. He reads in his own clothing. Chazan hakneses notel sefer Torah. The Baal Koreh of the temple synagogue would bring a sefer Torah to him, and he would hand the Torah over to the Rav of the synagogue, the rabbi, nosno l'rosh knesses, v'rosh knesses nosno l'sagan, and then the rabbi would give over the sefer Torah to the assistant Kohen, v'hasagan, and then the assistant Kohen himself, nosno l'kohen gadol, that he would hand it off to the Kohen gadol. The Kohen Gadol omed umekabel. The Kohen Gadol would stand, he would receive the Torah, the Koreh, he would read it. Koreh omed, he reads it while he stands, and he reads the various texts that are listed in the Mishnah as follows. But what is this telling us? There was actually a synagogue, there was actually a shul within the Beis HaMikdash itself. So that would indicate that the synagogue, that would indicate that the shul did not replace the Beis HaMikdash, but at least in its initial years, the institution complemented the Beis HaMikdash. It did something that was not being done within the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash. And we know of many synagogues that predate the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And in fact, the earliest description that we have of a mechitza comes to us from Philo of Alexandria, where he describes a synagogue in the, I think it was the Contemplative Life was the name of the book. Therapeutinae, I think, were the name of the group of people who were describing. These were Jewish ascetics who lived on an island, and they had their synagogue, they had their shul, and he describes their congregation where they would pray as having a division where men would pray on one side, women would pray on the other, but it was a temporary structure because when the classes would be given, the mechitza would be removed and everyone would sit together. And this is from the 2nd century before the Common Era. So we know that synagogues existed at this time. But what were they there for? What exactly were they doing? What was the purpose of the synagogue at that point, especially as tefillah had not been as heavily instituted as where we are familiar with as we pray today? So the explanation that I believe is quite compelling argues that the synagogue, the shul, is an evolution. It developed from another institution that we might be familiar with, that of the Sha'ar Ha'ir, the gate of the city. The gate of the city, or at least perhaps the analog that we could understand to a greater extent, the town square was a location where members of the community would assemble for important tasks. We would assemble there, especially when it was necessary to create word of mouth. If we needed news information to travel, we would utilize the community institution of the town square, or in biblical times, the Sha'ar Ha'ir. So let's explore where the Sha'ar Ha'ir comes up in the Torah and in other sources. So here we have, in the very, very beginning, source number 1, we have a verse. This is describing Avraham. Avraham has to bury his wife, Sarah. Sarah has passed away. He needs to acquire property. So he's living just outside of Hebron in Kiryas Arba. He then goes off into Hebron and he addresses the assembled Bnei Ches, the Hittites, and he makes the following declaration. He says, I want to buy the field that belongs to Ephron, because in Ephron's field there's a wonderful cave called the Machpelah, and that is where I would like to bury my wife, Sarah. The Ephron Yoshed Besoch Bnei Ches. Ephron sat in the midst of the Bnei Ches. V'yan Ephron hachiti es Avraham be'oznei Bnei Ches. And so Ephron answered, Avraham, in the midst of the Bnei Ches, in earshot of all of the assembled, l'chol bo'ei shar iro, to all those who were gathered by the city gates. What happens there? Avraham purchases the field. And we continue. We say, Avraham lemikne le'ene b'nei ches b'chol bo'ei shar iro. And Avraham acquired the property in the presence of all those who had gathered by the city gates. The city gate was a place where everyone gathered. Why was it necessary for Avraham and Ephron to conduct this business arrangement by the gate of the city in the presence of the entire town? Why couldn't they just go to some back room, smoke a cigar, have some scotch, and negotiate some equitable agreement that would satisfy both parties? Why do they have to do this in public in front of everyone? Well, in an era before documentation was readily available, in a time when perhaps records were not as plentiful, it was a form of protection. If somebody were to purchase property and nobody were to know about it, should the individual pass away who sold the property, all of his heirs would come out of the woodwork. They would ask the individual, what are you doing on our Uncle Ephron's field? Uncle Ephron owned this field, and the purchaser would be given the boot. The Sha'ar Ha'ir, the public square where this was conducted and where the transaction took place, was a method of protecting the purchaser to ensure that in a time when no records would be available, it would be widely known that this transaction actually transpired. So the Sha'ar Ha'ir was a place where everyone would gather, where word of mouth could spread. And we see this in other contexts as well. Take a look at the next source. This is talking about what took place after the rape of Dinah. Shechem raped Dinah. Shechem and Hamor, who were the leaders of the city of Shechem, approached Yaakov and his sons as saying, we would like Dinah to become part of our family. And the Bnei Yaakov, Yaakov's sons, say, okay, you all got to circumcise yourselves. So what then happens? Hamor and Shechem go to the city of Shechem And where do they go specifically to address the entirety of the people? It says, Vayovo Chamor v'Shchem beno el shar Ira. They spoke to the inhabitants, the citizens of the city, by the city gates. Vayidabru el anshe Iram lemor, and they spoke to the people there, saying, and they convinced them. Vayishmu el Chamor, they listened to Chamor. Ve'el Shchem beno, and they listened to Shchem, his son. Koyotze shar Iro, all those who were assembled by the city gates. And he says that they circumcised themselves and they went out into the city from the gate of the city. So we similarly find over here that Shechem and Hamor needed to have a citywide meeting in order for them to gain consensus and to enter into this agreement with Yaakov and his families. It required every member of the town to be a participant to this decision. And where did this decision take place? Bishar Iram, because this is where they met. This is where the city would all gather. This is where consensus would be accrued. The Shar Ha'ir was where the town would gather to conduct important business and to gain consensus and to enter into agreements with foreign peoples, let's say. We also see that even within the obligations that we have within the Torah that Jews have, not as just simply describing a historical precedent, but also we see that within Torah law itself, there are similar obligations where we have to go to the city gates to perform various tasks. Let's take a look. The next source that you have over here is this source right on the top of the page here, source number 3. This is talking about the Ben Sorer Umore, the wayward and rebellious son. The parents of the son grab hold of the boy and they take him to the city gates. The mother and the father shall lay hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city and to the gates of his place, to the Shar Ha'ir. That's where the trial would be conducted. The next verse you also see over here, this is about an adulterous couple. It says, you will take the two of them out to the city gates, and you'll stone them, and you kill the young woman and the young man. And where is this all taking place? It's all taking place by the city gates. And finally, in the book of Joshua, where we talk about the cities of refuge, the Arei Miklat, it says, V'nas el achas me'ha'arim ha'ela, v'omad hasach shar ha'ir, v'daber be'oznei ziknei ha'ir hahi. It says there that they designated cities of refuge, and these cities of refuge would be places where if someone was guilty of inadvertently, accidentally killing someone, in order to escape the vengeful relatives of the murdered person, they run away to the city. And where is the trial conducted? Where does the city decide whether or not this person passes muster and he will be accepted into the city? His case qualifies and he deserves their protection. Where does that take place? That takes place B'Sha'ar Ha'ir, by the city gates. Why? Why do all these 3 cases take place by the city gates? I think the answer is very, very simple. These are court cases. These are court cases that require witness testimony. These are all court cases that involve, the death penalty. We don't want to put anyone to death who doesn't deserve it. If you conduct a trial in the public square where everybody will hear, where everyone will be assembled, that means that if someone knows something about the case, they can be a witness to the innocence of some of the participants. They have the ability, they know the trial is taking place. They can stand up and say, I'm a witness. That Ben Sorer Umur, that wayward, rebellious son, is not really a wayward or rebellious son. He's a good boy. His parents are angry about this, that, or the other thing. Or I know for a fact that those witnesses who are claiming that the adulterous act took place were not viable witnesses because they were with me in the next town over conducting a deal. If we conduct court in the public square, news travels, witnesses will come forward, and the individuals will be tried justly. There'll be no corruption of justice. We need these cases to take place in the public square so that everybody is aware, so that everyone knows. Again, the city square comes out to be, or the Shar Ha'ir, the city gates, comes to be an important city institution where people gather, where commerce is conducted, as we'll see shortly, and it's where we can act in such a manner to call upon witnesses and conduct businesses that have bearing on the entire community. What other cases do we see require the Shar Ha'ir? What other instances do we find in the Torah that require that the transactions or the events or that they be, whatever they are, be conducted in the city gates? Take a look at the book of Ruth. The bottom source over here, I'm going to scroll to the next page so everybody can see the English as soon as the computer is done thinking. There we go. Okay. Let me just put this person in. All right. So here you have the story of Ruth. Ruth is propositions Boaz for marriage, and Boaz says, "Okay, I'll marry you, but I have to make sure that the other individual who perhaps has greater claim decides to not take advantage of the opportunity." So where do they go? Boaz went up to the city gate and he sat down there, and behold, the next of kin whom Boaz had spoken came by, and he said, "Hey there, Ploni Almoni, anonymous so-and-so, come and sit here." He turned aside and he gathered 10 men among the elders of the city, and they conducted the Beis Din. That is where the Beis Din met, and this took place in the city gates. Why was it necessary for that to take place at the city gates? Well, you actually can see over here from the Torah Tzimim, he actually creates a legal theory behind it. He essentially says that there are various kinds of court cases. You know, we're not trying somebody, for example, like in the cases that were mentioned earlier, but rather we're talking, for example, about marriage. Marriage has communal importance because it indicates who is available and who's not available for spouses, and what are the relationships or the inappropriate relationships that can perhaps create problems for who can marry whom. So the Torah Tzimima works out a legal theory. And this is what he says. Therefore, it appears to me that I need to differentiate between various circumstances. When the matter concerns the Jewish public in general and needs to be publicized to all Jews, then 10 men must be present for the act to be considered a public act. Doing the same before 3 men might also be considered publicizing, but you will not be confident that the publicizing before 3 men will cause the message to be delivered to the greater Jewish public. However, concerning a personal matter involving one individual, publicizing in front of 3 is sufficient. So we did distinguish between different kinds of court cases. Some require 3 judges, some require 10 judges, and the difference between them is the level of publicity that is required. Again, the idea here is that the Shar Ha'ir services this need, this requirement for public knowledge of this instance, that transaction, or this other court case. So the Shar Ha'ir is an ancient Jewish institution that serves an incredibly important function. It is the place where Jews gather. It's the place where we conduct business. It's the place where we conduct trial. So the city gate is a place where we get together to do important things. Let's take a look now at the final source. I'm going to scroll down to the English. I'm going to be reading it from the Hebrew. You'll have the English in front of you. You can follow along. This is from the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah lived at the time of the Second Temple. This was after the destruction of the First Temple. After 70 years, the Jews were allowed to return to Israel. Ezra and Nehemiah led the Jews to Israel, and they reestablished many old Jewish institutions. And some Jewish institutions were created as new creations. And here, for example, we find the very first example of the public reading of the Torah, Kriyas HaTorah. Let's read what it says. Ve'osvu kol ha'am ki ish echad el rechov asher lifnei shar hamayim. The entire nation gathered together, all these immigrants from Israel who came with Nehemiah and came with Ezra, they gathered in Jerusalem by the street just in front of the city gates, the Shar Hamayim. And what do? Vayomru LaEzra HaSofer. And they said to Ezra, the scribe, Lahavia Sefer Torahs Moshe Asher Tziva Hashem Es Yisrael. We want you to bring the Sefer Torah out to us. We want you to read it for us. We want to hear what it says. Again, this is the first example that we have of a public reading of the Torah. And where is it taking place? The city gates, the Sha'ar Ha'ir. Vayavi Ezra HaKohen Es HaTorah Lifnei HaKol. Ezra brought the Sefer Torah and brought it in front of the assembled people. He read this, he brought it out for all the men, for all the women, and all those who could understand, and he read it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So the first reading of the Torah we see over here was not a decision made from on high that the Torah should be read. Rather, the people demanded it, and it was first read on Rosh Hashanah. And where did he read it? He read it by the city gates. What did he read it on? This gets even more interesting. He read it in the city gate. He read it from early morning until noon. Neged ha'anashim va'anoshim ha'mevinim v'oznei kol ha'am el sefer ha'torah v'yamod Ezra sefer al migdal eitz. He stood on a bima. He stood on a wooden platform. Asher also ledavar, that was made specifically for this purpose. So the very first Kriyas Torah had a bima. V'yamod etzlo metasya v'shema v'anoya v'uriya v'chelkia u'maaseya al yamino, and he had 6 people standing on his right side. Umismaolo, and from his left side, Pedaya, Mishoel, Malkaya, V'choshum, V'chashvadana, Zachariah, U'Meshullam, and he had 7 people standing on his left side. This is where we know that when you read the Torah, there has to be a gabbai standing to the left of the Balkore, of the reader, and a person standing to the right, because you see that Ezra, when he read the Torah for the very first time, he had at least a few people standing to his left and standing to his right. So he's on the bima. He has people, he has a gabbai rishon and a gabbai sheni. Vayiftach Ezra has-sefer la'enei kol ha'am, and he performed hagba. He picked it up and showed the sefer, and it was displayed before the eyes of the entire assembled nation. And the next verse says, Vayivarach Ezra es Hashem Elokim hagadol. He said Baruch Hu. He made a blessing. He ascribed greatness to God. Vayanu kol ha'am amen amen. All the people, they heard this bracha and they responded saying amen. So this is Kriyas Torah almost exactly as we're familiar with. It's on a bima. It is, there's Hagba, there's a Gabbai Rishon, there's a Gabbai Sheni, and he's reading it, and he's responding to the demand of the community that it be read to them. And where is he reading it? In their version of the shul, the Sha'ar Ha'ir, a place where everybody gathered together. The synagogue is an evolution of the Sha'ar Ha'ir, which was a community institution, a place where people would gather for important tasks. What was the important task here? I'm going to explain shortly. I believe that the public reading of the Torah is a form of reacceptance. It's a renewal of vows, as it were, of our obligations and our acceptance of the Torah. So this was a very important community decision that required everyone to gather together, and this is how it was done. This is how it was performed. The shul is an evolution of the Sha'ar Ha'ir, and the very first shuls were not for prayer, but they were for public reading of the Torah. And that's where the sources that I started with become really important, because you see here in the Beis HaMikdash, what was the shul for? It was for the reading of the Torah. We see here also in the inscription on the plaque of that shul in Yerushalayim during the Beis HaMikdash, this congregation that existed, what was it for? It doesn't say prayer there. It says he built the synagogue for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments. So the original synagogue was probably a community institution, an evolution of the Sha'ar Ha'ir, and it functioned as a location, as a place for public reading of the Torah. That is what the shul evolved from. Now, what is the purpose of the public reading of the Torah? We've discussed several different possibilities. In a previous class, I mentioned that under some circumstances, the public reading of the Torah can actually form a sort of prayer, like on a fast day, when we say along with the Baal Koreh, the 13 attributes of God's mercy. So the reading of the Torah is a form of tefillah, it's a form of prayer under some circumstances. On its most basic level, as we're going to see, the Rambam holds, Maimonides is of the opinion that the public reading of the Torah is entirely about teaching Torah. And we see this as follows. I'm going to skip right ahead to that, and I'll go back to this that I want to say. Okay, computer, you can think it through. Okay, here you go. This is a response. This is a letter that some people in another location asked the Rambam, Maimonides, and they wanted to ask the following question. It's a very, very good question. It's a question that I get asked with surprising frequency. Let's see what the question was. It says, concerning a situation where a group does not have a Sefer Torah from which to read, may they read from a Chumash and still recite the bracha before and after each aliyah, or should they omit the performance of Kriyas Torah, the reading of the Torah? The same question could be asked about a Sefer Torah that was not written correctly and which we know is invalid. Can we continue to use it for the public reading of the Torah? Can we say the brachos before in each aliyah? Or should we just, if we don't have another Torah, we just don't have the public reading of the Torah? Teach us, our teacher, how should we conduct ourselves? This is not the way we decide. This is the Rambam's opinion, but the Rambam is not the only opinion, and halakha does not necessarily always follow his opinion. But I want to point out to you what his opinion is, because it definitely indicates to us how he understood the mitzvah of reading the Torah. This is what he says. He says, Mutar levarech ve'ena bracha ala kriya b'sefer, kamo shehabracha al netilas lulav o yeshiva b'sukkah. He says, yes, it is permitted to recite a bracha, even if you're reading from a chumash, even if the Sefer Torah is invalid. You can conduct yourself like you would with a kosher Sefer Torah, because he says the blessings that are said for the aliyah are not like the brachot that we say before we shake the lulav or before we sit in a sukkah. What's important about those mitzvot? Well, what's important about those mitzvot is the proper performance of the mitzvah. If you don't do it correctly, then you haven't performed the mitzvah. And if you haven't performed the mitzvah, one should not make a bracha. So yes, obviously, if you do not have a kosher sukkah, if you don't have a kosher arba minim, if you don't have a kosher lulav, you do not make the bracha before you pick them up and shake them, because the mitzvah is not being done. However, he says, however, concerning Kriyas HaTorah, the bracha is recited because of the reading. In other words, the words are the same whether the Sefer Torah is invalid or if you're reading from a Chumash. The mitzvah is defined as reading the words of the Torah. It's not the rule that if in the morning a person studies, is it not the rule that in the morning if a person studies any aspect of Torah, he must say Birchat HaTorah before he studies Torah in advance of doing so? Yet still, he says, we make the bracha before we read the Torah. The public reading of the Torah, he says, the mitzvah there is to teach Torah, to recite the words of the Torah. It's so that people should hear them and be guided by them, he says. So as such, he says, it doesn't matter what the source of those words of the Torah are. The public reading of the Torah is about teaching Torah. You can do that with an invalid Torah. You can do that with a Chumash. Thus, the Rambam says, if you have an invalid Torah, you say the brachot on it, and you read it like you normally would, because you're still performing the mitzvah there. You don't need a kosher Torah. All you need to do is study Torah, teach Torah, read the words, and say the words, and hear the words of the Torah. According to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, the purpose of the mitzvah of reading the Torah publicly is to study Torah and teach Torah. To the degree that he says you don't even need a kosher one, the words are important, not the source. So the Rambam says the public reading of the Torah is all about studying Torah. Let's read possibility number 3 as to what the purpose of this mitzvah is. Right? So if you recall, we said it's a form of tefillah. The Rambam says it's about the study of Torah. I am going to show you several sources that perhaps suss out a different understanding. And it's something that I alluded to earlier. I might have even said it explicitly. Where do I want to start? I want to start from over here. Where is this? Where am I starting from? This one here. I want to be here. Okay, Maseches Tamid. So this is talking about the order of services in the Beit HaMikdash. As they would be offering korbanot, they did other things as well. Various prayers would be recited. So it says here that Kohen Gadol would say, it says, Baruch Baruch hu beracha achas. He says, I want you to make a bracha. He would say this to the assembled Kohanim. V'hein baruch hu, and they would make a bracha. Kiru'u aseres hadibros. They would take out a Sefer Torah and they would read the Ten Commandments. They would read the Shema. They would read the second paragraph of the Shema, V'haya im shamoa. Then they would read the third paragraph of the Shema, Vayomer. Then they would say, Baruch hu es ha'am shalosh barachos. They would then recite three blessings. Emes v'yatziv, which was the one blessing that followed the Shema. Ba'avoda, they would recite the one bracha of the Amida, which talks about the temple service. Ubirchas kohanim, and then they would say the Kohanic blessing. Uv'Shabbos mosifin bracha achas lemishmar hayotzi. And on Shabbos, they would recite an additional prayer for the Kohanic shift as they would transition from one to the next. They would work a week apiece, and the next shift would take over. So we see that in the Beit HaMikdash, as part of their morning service, they would read from the Ten Commandments. We also see from Masechet Brachot in the Talmud that there was an attempt also to establish this as the daily service even outside of the Beit HaMikdash. It says, V'korin aseret hadibrot. They would read from the Ten Commandments. They would read the Shema. They would read V'hayim shamoa. And then they would read the paragraph Vayomer. Then they would say the bracha that follows the Shema, Emes v'yatziv. Then they would recite the bracha of the avoda, of the performing the service. Then birchas kohanim. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Shmuel. So that was what was going on in the temple. Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, Af bigvulen bikshu likros came. That there was an attempt at one point to even establish reading the Ten Commandments every single day, even outside the temple, as part of our morning service. Ela shekvar bitlum mipnei ta'arumas haminim. There were sectarians who created problems, and therefore we annulled the reading of the Ten Commandments. Now, this is really important. What exactly were we? What was the annulment here? Why did they read them, and why did they stop reading them? Well, this is actually a response to Christianity. I guess this is if somebody wants to write a university a PhD thesis on the influence of Christianity on Talmudic Judaism. This is perhaps article number one. The Christians believe that since the death of Yashka, since the death of Jesus, the world now lives under the grace of God, which means that we no longer have to keep any of the commandments, any of the mitzvahs, any of the Torah. It's just completely done away with. No longer have to worry about it. However, I did have to look this up. I did go through a Wikipedia article on Christians' view of commandments just to verify this is correct. They do believe that the Ten Commandments are left as obligatory. That's actually one of the reasons why, that you have in the United States all this to do about the Ten Commandments in courtrooms, because Christians believe that the Ten Commandments are the only Torah commandments that they have to keep. Judaism believes, however, that the Ten Commandments are no more significant than any other commandment in the Torah. Just as we have an obligation to keep the Shabbat, as it says in the Ten Commandments, we also have to put on tefillin every morning. We also have to do any number of things, sit in a sukkah, eat matzah on Pesach, not eat chametz. Those are all important, and they have just as much authority. They have the same level of onus, the same level of importance. And as such, the rabbi said, we cannot do anything. We cannot act in any way that shows that the Ten Commandments are more important than any other commandment, because that would to feed the sectarian, these Christians who are living in our midst, who are claiming that we don't have to keep anything, and the Ten Commandments are indeed more significant. In order to remove that possibility from our minds, they did away with reading from the Ten Commandments. But why would we read the Ten Commandments daily? Well, the Ten Commandments are really important because it remembers the revelation of Sinai. We also see something else. Take a look over here. This is from the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. What does it say there? I'm going to read this quickly in English. Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, went to a synagogue where a person stood up to translate. Basically, he was reading from the Torah, but he wasn't standing. He was leaning against a wall. Rabbi Shmuel said to him, it's forbidden for you to do so. Just as the Torah was given at Har Sinai in fear and trepidation, you have to act reverentially. So too, we read the Torah reverentially. You cannot lean, you cannot be sitting, you must stand if you're reading the Torah. Rabbi Chagai said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, that Rabbi Shmuel went to the synagogue where an Amora, a Talmudic rabbi by the name of Huna, was standing on the bima, and he was called up for an aliyah. But when his aliyah was done, he left, and no one went up to stand in his place. And Rabbi Shmuel said to them, no, you can't do that. You cannot leave the bima. You cannot have somebody, the bima can never be denuded of people. There always has to be somebody standing there. You can't leave until somebody else comes up to replace you, which we do now. The Ola doesn't leave until the next aliyah because he has to wait definitively until somebody else comes up to replace him. You cannot leave it. Why can you not leave it? Well, because how was the Torah given? God stood on the mountain, and Moshe was the go-between who took God's message and brought it to us. So too, there always has to be somebody who will stand on the bima to be that go-between between the Torah itself and us, the congregation. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi remarked in the last line, I stood between you. This is what Moshe says. I stood between you and God at that time in order to deliver to you the words of God. So we see over here that we're even, when we read the Torah, we even reenact how the Torah was given. So we recall how the Torah was given by reading the Ten Commandments, or maybe not. But when we're reading the Torah, we reenact how the Torah was given, and we see something further. When we make the brachot for the aliyah, the Ramban says over here, what exactly are we doing when we make the bracha? We're commanded to thank God each time we read from the Torah because of the great good that God bestowed upon us by giving us the Torah and by advising us of the way we should conduct our lives through which we can inherit life in the world to come. He's saying whenever we read the Torah, we express our thanks for the Torah. So we have three things happening whenever we read the Torah. We're expressing our thanks for having received the Torah. We reenact how the Torah was given, and we recall how the Torah was given. What I think these three things add up to is that we are renewing our vows, we're reviewing our commitment to the Torah. We are receiving the Torah anew. This is a new revelation. We're now entering into that same time and that same space at Har Sinai, where the Jewish people stood and said, Nasa v'nishma, you will do and we will hear. We're doing the same thing. We're reenacting, we're remembering, we're thankful. We are reliving the revelation of Har Sinai every time the Torah was given. This is actually echoed in a responsa from Moshe Feinstein. You can read it if you want. I'm happy to send it to you, the text, but this is essentially what he says. But it's most clearly articulated here from a prayer that's said in the Moroccan Siddur after the Torah reading. This is what it says. Do I have this right here? No, here. I hereby accept upon myself the obligations of the Torah that was given to us by God through Moshe Rabbeinu. I hereby accept it anew with complete and unconditional acceptance. This acceptance is done with my complete heart and all my soul, with all my possessions, all 248 of my bones and 365 of my body parts. This acceptance is without even a shred of compulsion, but is done with joy and with a good heart. My wish is to include all of the Jewish people individually and as a group. This acceptance should be upon me, my children, and my children's children, till the end of time. Amen. This is articulated even in its tefillah, what it is that we're trying to do. And this actually answers one question. With this, I'll conclude the class. We've been going on for a while. This answers a really, really compelling question. The Amidah that we recite on Shabbat removes the middle 13 brachot of the weekday Amidah. We say the first three blessings, which are praises of God. We recite the last three blessings, which are statements of thanksgiving to God. But the middle 13 brachot, we excise on Shabbat because they are personal requests. We don't want to be reminded of all the needs that we have on Shabbat. We don't want our Shabbat to be marred by remembering, oh, I have to make a living, and I know that my uncle is sick, and I have to pray on his behalf that he should be healed, and I'm worried about the crops. Could you please send rain? All the worries, all the concerns, all the the day-to-day niggles and moans that we have come to the fore when we make personal requests on Shabbat. So they're excised from the Shmona Esrei, from the Amidah that we recite on Shabbat, on Shabbos. So why do we say a Misha Berach on Shabbos? Why do we say a prayer for those who are sick? Why do we say a prayer for the government? Why do we say prayer for the armed forces? Why is it that we ask that Hashem should protect the Jews and take vengeance against our enemies? Why are we mentioning all these things during Kriyas Torah? Because we recite all those things part and parcel of the reading of the Torah. And the answer is because the moment that the Aron is opened and we take out the Torah, we're now no longer in Shul and it's no longer Shabbos. We're in a different dimension, in a different time, when we're standing by the foot of Har Sinai and we're accepting the Torah anew. God is here, God in presence. This is an ace ratzon. This is an auspicious time for God to respond to our personal requests. So because God is present, because we're existing in a different time, in a different place, and because to not make these requests would perhaps deny God's presence, we make these personal requests while the Torah is present, while we're reading, because the reading of the Torah brings us into a completely new dynamic with new rules, new regulations. It's completely different. We're in this twilight zone. We're no longer in Calgary. We're in the Sinai desert. We're no longer in the house of Jacob. We're at the foot of Har Sinai. And the rabbi's not there. It's Moshe Rabbeinu, and God is just as present in House of Jacob as he is by Har Sinai. But it's at that time that we should be making requests, because to not do so perhaps denies God's presence, but it's an exceptionally special time. And when it's a special time, even on Shabbos, you can make personal requests. So again, what exactly am I claiming? I'm saying that the reading of the Torah on Shabbat accomplishes several things. It is public teaching of the Torah. It is sometimes a form of prayer, but most importantly, it is a renewal of the acceptance. It's a renewal of Kabbalah Satorah that we're experiencing then and there at the foot of Har Sinai. The Bima becomes our mountain, and the Balkore becomes our Moshe. And with that, I will conclude the class, and I'm open to questions, comments, and or rebuttals.